using a different kind of light. Instead, it used X-ray beams instead of light. That's what an X-ray is. It's just like taking a photograph, only you use a different wavelength of light. In this case, you use a wavelength that's very short. That's an X-ray beam that goes through things. So the same issues take place when you do an X-ray as you do with a photograph. You have to worry about focal length. You have to worry about focusing. You have to worry about coning it down. You have to worry, about scatter radiation, scatter light. Are any of you guys photographers here? Do photography. You understand about film, and you understand about exposure time and shutter speed, all those things, right? They are exactly what happens when you take an X-ray. That's all it is. And so that's what you get. You just get a different kind of photograph using a different kind of light source. Okay? So an MRI is a completely different modality. An MRI is actually using a magnetic field to measure inflammation of the molecules. It's completely different. There are no X-rays. There's no light. There's no nothing. It's just a magnet. So what you're finding with an MRI is something different than what you find with an X-ray. It's a different process, completely. And an X-ray only shows you bones. An MRI shows you soft tissues and tendons and ligaments and fluid and all those things. And those things are affected by inflammation. You can't see fluid on an X-ray. Only Superman had X-ray eyes that could see, all these things. But an X-ray machine only sees the bones. So they're different. So your doctor has to make a decision about what he or she is looking for and how they're looking for it to choose whether something's an X-ray or an MRI. They're not the same thing. Okay? You all understand that? More questions, guys? I know when they walk up with a clipboard, I'm in trouble.
Yeah.
Come on up.
Am I on the floor? Am I on?
Sure.
Okay. Mine is two parts. One is I read a book that said a man cured his AS by his diet, and he eliminated all the starch, all the lactose, and all the sugar, which is the flour, corn, breads, pastas, fruits, veggies, beans, everything imaginable that you can eat. And I tried it kind of and didn't have a whole lot of success. Is there any data on that, or is somebody just making a few extra bucks? It's a healthy diet, I'm sure, but...
Diet therapies have taken hold because of the fact that our other therapies don't always work. They become popular. When they're studied in a rigorous way, they don't show an impact. And it's hard to study diets. It's hard to control for it.
Mm-hmm.
Because people know what they're doing, and you have to study in a more rigorous way.
Okay.
On the other hand, if you change the bowel flora by your diet, it might do something. It's like antibiotic therapy, for instance, for rheumatoid arthritis or ankylosing spondylitis. There's a whole movement to use, the minocyclines and tetracyclines and things like that, antibiotic therapy. The problem is that antibiotic therapy certain antibiotics actually have a mild anti-inflammatory effect, somewhat to the level of a Motrin. So if you study antibiotics like minocycline in large controlled trials, hundreds, maybe thousands of patients, you can show a statistically significant difference because the antibiotic has an anti-inflammatory effect. If you took the same group of patients and studied Motrin, you'd show the same effect. So it's not clinically important effect. but it's statistically significant. So diets and antibiotics and some of these therapies, there's a popularization of them, okay? But they don't. I have to sit down for a second. I've been up for a long period of time, so my back goes. I have 2 hours on my back and then I'm done. The antibiotics and others, they have a mild non-specific effect. Okay, and that mild non-specific effect will show up in a clinical study. So that kind of answers your question. When you subject these things rigorous proof, they fall out.
Okay. I have another question, if I may ask it, hopefully quickly. I use an intrathecal drug delivery system, which is a pain pump that puts pain medication directly to my spinal cord. And any of the anti-TNF medicines, do you know if anything like that could be used with a narcotic? I mean, if something like that was infused on a regular basis, in addition to pain control, would there be any benefit?
I am not aware of anybody using local installation of the anti-TNF drugs.
Okay.
It might work, but I'm not aware of it.
Okay.
One of the things that's confused us and compounded a lot of our problems, at least in Los Angeles, is that free enterprise system once again. Some guy got a hold of a use patent for etanercept or Enbrel for mechanical back pain or disc pain. He was one of these entrepreneurial docs in Los Angeles. And somehow he got a use patent. So he went out in the newspaper and advertised himself as, he's called Disc Cure. When you go see him for your disc disease or degenerative disease, you get Enbrel or etanercept. He gives it to you. But he doesn't tell you what the name is. He puts a different name on it. Immunex sued him. I don't know what happened with that. I don't know what the outcome. Yeah, but it turns out that if you have a disc protruding, it causes inflammation. So if you give any anti-inflammatory drug, it helps. Give people steroids, it helps. Or if you give Enbrel, it helps. So patients felt better. And so he advertises this out there. So you can, if you have a disc problem, you go to Disc Cure and spend $1,200 for 2 injections of this magic stuff, and he gives it to you. So you can see how the whole world gets complicated. You know, when you start throwing in financial rewards, and income issues, it messes things up a little bit. In terms of, pay. Oh yeah.
Insurance company.
No, but this is. You ought to come to Los Angeles to see what goes on out there. Question.
I have a comment and then 2 questions. Hopefully they're short. The one comment is the lady here earlier talking about the diagnosis name changing. My father was called rheumatoid spondylitis and rheumatoid arthritis by many people for many years, so I believe that's part of it too. But my 2 questions have to do with, one, you talk about triggers, and I was wondering if you could talk some more about that and if that's being included in the evaluation process, like what's your past history. You did mention one about bacteria in the stomach in Mexico, but are there other things like, I remember things like strep throat. And then my other question has to do with AS. Is there other forms of arthritis that a lot of people have associated with AS?
Why don't we deal with the first 2 questions? Because I can't remember.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. It's only been really since the late 60s, mid to late 60s, that ankylosing spondylitis was actually culled out of the whole group of inflammatory rheumatic diseases as a separate entity. In fact, if you go back to the literature of the 60s and you go to the world's greatest hospital, what was the world's greatest hospital? No, the Massachusetts General Hospital. Man's greatest hospital, right? MGH, man's greatest hospital. That's what it was called. Harvard Medical School, okay, the be-all and end-all. They refused to recognize that there was a difference between rheumatoid arthritis and ankylosing spondylitis. Flat out refused. And they called it rheumatoid spondylitis. And this was a very powerful influence on American medicine. And it was really only until the discovery of rheumatoid factor testing, which was positive in rheumatoid arthritis patients and negative in spondylitis, and HLA-B27 testing, which was positive in spondylitis and negative in rheumatoid arthritis, that people in the United States, physicians, finally accepted that these were different diseases, even though it was obvious they were different. And so today, some of the old-fashioned doctors still call it rheumatoid spondylitis, I'm sure. And that's what your father's issue was all about. That's the same thing for psoriatic arthritis and psoriasis. Everyone thought that was just rheumatoid arthritis patients with psoriasis. But it turns out that you do careful epidemiologic studies and you look at the X-ray changes and X-ray differences between RA and psoriatic arthritis, and then you do B27 testing, and then you do rheumatoid factor testing, you can separate them out as different diseases. Both are more common in women, both cause peripheral arthritis, they both look roughly the same to the uninitiated, and it took a while before they were separated out. Your other question was about triggered. What triggers the disease? Children get ankylosing spondylitis. What is it that triggers it in children, in childhood?
Okay. It wasn't so much the trigger as it part of the evaluation process that you showed up there to find that population that's not getting diagnosed early.
Well, I guess I didn't get your question right. I thought you were asking about what the possible triggers were that brings it out or that causes it.
No, part of the evaluation process to find out if you have AS or should be looking at those things.
We haven't quite gotten to the point where we could identify a single pathogen or a trigger to diagnose the disease. But it may be that with the further understanding of these genes, the new genes, and the pathways that the genes represent, that these pathways could represent actually something which could then identify what could trigger that pathway. Do you see what I'm saying? In other words, in Crohn's disease, for example, with the identification of the pathway in Crohn's, that pathway responds to a specific organism. And then, if it responds to that organism, we can identify what that organism is. So the further genetic testing and understanding we do, the more likely it is that the genes and the gene products and the gene pathways will identify what in the environment interacted with it. That is going to be, I think, in the next 10 years, the wave of the future. Because if you think about it, there are only 3 ways the environment can impact you. Something you eat, something you breathe, or something on your skin. We know that lupus is a disease that can be triggered by something that affects your skin, sunlight. We know that rheumatoid arthritis is affected by something you breathe, cigarette smoking, air pollution. So what is it that affects spondylitis? What triggers spondylitis? Well, we know that the reactive arthritis, we have a lot of this indirect information. We know that reactive arthritis, or Reiter's disease, is triggered by Salmonella, Shigella, Campylobacter, and those organisms. So we know that. We know that Crohn's disease is triggered by organisms. We know there's subclinical inflammation of the gut in ankylosing spondylitis. So we're going to be close to finding out what is probably in the GI tract. That's the trigger. Something ubiquitous, something that you all come in contact with on a regular basis. And added to that your genetic predisposition, boom, it happens. So what can you do to prevent it? Well, that's another story. But that's really what I think is going to happen in the next 10 years.
In respect of Dr. Weisman's time and having to catch a flight, this will have to be the last question.
I was just curious how prevalent other diseases are in families with ankylosing spondylitis diagnosis.
That's exactly what we're looking for now in our research project. We're going to be looking at family members of AS patients and trying to bring them in and identify them and see what the prevalence is of things like psoriasis, iritis, psoriatic arthritis, other issues that occur in families.
Immune deficiencies? Autoimmune deficiencies in general? Or?
Well, I don't use the word autoimmune, but other diseases that come under the whole rubric of spondylitis.
Okay.
And we're trying to do that. And then the tools we're using are very crude to make those diagnoses. And as Lori knows, we're having discussions now about what kind of tools that we're using to try and find out which family members have the disease. Well, that's exactly, your question is really good. That's exactly what we're doing.
Because it ends up there's out of 6 people or 5 people in my family, my mother and myself both have AS. She also has osteoporosis. My brother has MG or mesothelioma gravis.
Myasthenia gravis, yeah.
Yeah, and one of my other sisters also has some digestive problems. So I was just curious as to how that was.
Well, that's what we're trying to do.
How prevalent it was.
That's what we're trying to do. It's a good question. All right, thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Weisman.